Welcome to the broadcast. I'm David Feldman, davidfeldmanshow.com. Friend me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter, and I invite you to go to davidfeldmanshow.com to sign up for my newsletter. On today's program, we get a civics lesson on how exactly the new Democratic House of Representatives is going to work and how they're going to pick a leader with Mark Savasco, Congressman Ted Lieu's brilliant chief of staff. Stay with me.
The David Feldman radio program is made possible by listeners like you. You sad, pathetic humps.
You know, Ron Chernow, he's the historian. He wrote Washington, has a new biography about Ulysses S. Grant. He wrote that big book about Hamilton, upon which the play, the musical, was based. Well, the White House Correspondents' Dinner announced on Monday that he's going to be the entertainment. Ron Chernow, the historian, is going to be the entertainment next year at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Give me a break. Everyone knows Ron Chernow isn't funny. It takes 633 pages before the first laugh. Screw him. That guy couldn't ad-lib a at an all-you-can-eat buffet. Ron Chernow isn't funny. Just another excuse not to hire another woman for the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Samantha Bee would have been great next year. So they've decided to replace the comedian with a historian. Maybe they can start replacing White House correspondents with actual correspondents instead of professional wrestlers. It's pure cowardice to go with a historian. Historians are there to calm the waters, putting times of crisis into perspective and offering up crap like, America has been divided before. We'll survive this hiccup too. Hiccup. We'll survive this hiccup too. 620,000 Americans died during the civil hiccup. 37 million people died during World Hiccup 1. How many people died because Ronald Reagan ignored the AIDS hiccup? This is not a hiccup. This is a constitutional crisis. We don't need to put it into perspective. There's a time and a place for historians. We don't need them at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. We don't need to hear some tweety guy with patches on his elbow talking about John Adams and Woodrow Wilson silencing the press. I don't want to hear about the Pentagon Papers. I don't want perspective. I don't want to be told to calm down because eventually American history corrects itself. Millions and millions of people die and suffer before American history corrects itself. I don't want to hear that. Hiring a historian like Ron Chernow for the White House Correspondents' Dinner, it's pure chicken. I don't want to hear about the genius of our founding fathers who gave us all the tools we'll ever need to fix the mess we're in. That's religious hogwash, blind faith in fictitious white men whose holy writ is even more irrelevant right now than the Bible. See the Electoral College, women and African American suffrage, or the Second Amendment. And even more importantly, when it comes to the Constitution, let's remember that nothing good ever came out of Philadelphia, as in Bill Cosby, cheesesteak, and Mary Alonzo. If Sarah Huckabee Sanders and Donald Trump don't want to show up, then they don't show up. Good. I'm sure Ron Chernow is very interesting, especially if you're trying to impress your date. But he doesn't belong at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Also, Hamilton sucks. Never read it, never saw the play, but I know it sucks because it's a huge hit on Broadway, so it has to suck, because New York City sucks. Want to know what it smells like underneath Donald Trump's comb-over? Ride the Q train at 4 a.m.
The David Feldman radio program is made possible by listeners like you. You sad, pathetic humps.
I happen to believe if America ever becomes a fascist state, it will be because we don't teach civics in America. Most Americans don't understand how a bill becomes law. Most Americans want the president to be the most important officer in the land because that simplifies things. But democracy is messy. It's supposed to be messy. And nothing is messier than Congress. Nothing is messier than the House of Representatives because it's supposed to be messy. And Americans are supposed to understand that it's supposed to be messy. And they're also supposed to understand the mess. But they don't. So they tune it all out. And so our leaders rely on the simplicity of titillation to get our attention instead of good, solid policy. If Americans understood civics, we could put aside tribalism and start focusing on policy, on how to fix this country. Unless Americans understand civics, we will sink lower than titillation. We will want our dear leader to tell us how to think. So it's time now for Civics with Savasco. Mark Savasco is Chief of Staff for Congressman Ted Lieu, who, Howie Klein thinks, should be our next Speaker of the House instead of Nancy Pelosi. Welcome back to the show, Mark Savasco.
Great to be here, David. Thank you.
I want to teach civics. I want you to teach me civics. I want you to teach me how Congress works. You're the Chief of Staff. I'm pretty sure Congressman Ted Lieu, I don't think I'm speaking out of school here, I'm sure he would say that you know more about how Congress works than he does because you're supposed to know more than he does. The Speaker, when does Nancy Pelosi first put her speakership to a vote? There are 2 votes coming up. When is the first vote?
Yeah, so we're going to have a vote next week, next Wednesday, November 28th, in the Democratic caucus, where all of the Democrats who were elected to represent districts across the country for the 116th Congress will vote on the Speaker. And then there'll be another election, which will happen when the new Congress is formed on January 3rd. And that'll be the one on the House floor where the entire Congress is there, the Democrats and the Republicans.
Why is it the 116th Congress? How do you get that number?
We've had 116 Congresses since the nation was founded. Each Congress lasts for 2 years. And so it's essentially an election term for the House in particular. We obviously, senators have 6-year terms, so they are elected for 3 Congresses. But that's generally where it comes from, yeah.
What is a caucus? I always hear about all these caucuses, the Freedom Caucus. What does that mean?
Basically, a caucus, in the simplest terms, a caucus is just a way of organizing members in a representative body or an elected body. So technically speaking, our party structures, when it's just the members who are elected to Congress, they make up a caucus. And there are big caucuses, big powerful caucuses, like the Congressional Black Caucus or the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, New Dems, the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And then there are literally hundreds upon hundreds of other caucuses, the Cystic Fibrosis Caucus, the Battery Energy Storage Caucus, the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Caucus. There is almost a caucus for every cause out there. They're not all created equal, obviously. Many of them are just created nominally to sort of show support. Maybe if there's an issue that's a little bit broader than just having one bill or one letter or something like that, and you want to show a sort of coalition of people who support something, you might create a caucus.
There's a Cystic Fibrosis Caucus. Is there somebody who is in charge of that caucus? And what would the title be? Chairman of the caucus?
Correct. Yeah, there would be a chairman. Sometimes for most caucuses, especially like healthcare-related caucuses, you'll have co-chairs. So you'll try to get a chair from each party to try to show that it's a bipartisan caucus.
But not all caucuses are bipartisan.
No, that's correct. Yes, some caucuses are strictly one party or the other, like the Freedom Caucus.
The Democratic Caucus is not bipartisan. What was it? The Freedom Caucus is not bipartisan. Do they reach over to the Senate? Can there be a caucus that's both in the House and the Senate, or are they separate?
Yeah, there are sometimes bicameral caucuses.
What does bicameral mean?
So bicameral just indicates that I'm including both the House and the Senate.
You have the Cystic Fibrosis Caucus, and I'm not trivializing cystic fibrosis, but it's not one that you hear a lot about. And you intimated that there are some nominal caucuses where they exist in name only.
Correct. Yeah, for the most part. And again, so you may have a chairman that is, for whatever reason, either personally impacted by something or it has a strong connection to the district. They might find someone on the other side of the aisle that has a similar interest. they'll connect, they'll create a caucus. Maybe they'll do a letter once a year to the Appropriations Committee to fight for funding for whatever particular issue it is. Almost every country has a Friends of caucus, right? So there's like a Friends of Japan caucus and a Friends of, the Czech Republic caucus. And, lots of members of the foreign affairs committees tend to join these, and they just look out for the interests of whatever the cause is that it's been organized.
Now, that's kind of dangerous because foreign lobbyists, as we learned from the Manafort trial, have to be registered. It's illegal to accept money from foreign governments, I believe.
That's right.
If you trace the money, where does it go?
There's no real money involved with the caucuses. Usually, most of the small ones are just run out of particular member's office. So in other words, any staff time or resources would be used, would come from that member office. Some of the bigger caucuses, like Ted is, as an Asian American, he is a member of the Congressional Asian American Pacific Islander Caucus. They actually charge dues, or the CBC, the Black Caucus, or the CHC, they'll have some dues. So a small portion of we call it our MRA, but it's members representational allowance. It's basically our budget. A small portion of that will come out and will go towards the caucus, who can then maybe hire a full-time staffer or two to just manage caucus business.
But there are no offices.
Correct. No, there are no offices. Almost exclusively run out of members' offices, and we are, when it comes to those caucuses, like you mentioned, that are organized maybe for a different country or something like that, we're subject to all the same rules that apply to, every member of Congress or every, frankly, employee of the federal government. FARA applies. You can't accept gifts.
What is FARA?
It's the foreign agents. Something.
It's what
Manafort governs the. Right.
Manafort got into trouble. Most foreign lobbyists are not registered. They just don't care.
It's a topic we could do a whole separate podcast on. There's actually a lot of effort to reform the way we do FARA, a lot of it in response to Manafort, but actually as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, it is actually something that has come up for our new, once the Democrats take over in January, it may be something we address. So
when you say in order to be in the caucus, you have to pay dues, where does that money come from? It doesn't come out of the congressperson's salary, right? It comes out of their operating budget?
From our operating budget, correct. So member salaries are actually not included in what's called the MRA, the Members Representational Allowance. The MRA is essentially the office budget. So as the chief of staff, I manage the MRA. There's kind of a complicated formula to determine how much money each office gets. Some of it depends on what the transportation costs are for how far away, in other words, you are. So the member from Alaska may get a bit more because it's more expensive for him to go home than, say, representative from Maryland. But in general, they're all relatively close to each other. The only thing that doesn't come out of that is member of Congress salaries. Again, the vast majority of caucuses there is no budget. There's no cost associated with them. Most of them is just, again, a nominal thing. But some of the big ones. Yeah.
Okay. So the Democratic caucus would be the caucus for the Democratic Party within that House of Representatives. Is it bicameral?
No, I don't believe so. The people that will elect Nancy Pelosi or the speaker, or our leadership, I should say, of the caucus, those are House members. So that's a House caucus.
And who's in charge of the Democratic caucus? Who's the chairman?
So right now, the chairman of the caucus is Congressman Joe Crowley.
Not anymore.
Well, that's right. So technically, Joe Crowley's term doesn't end until January 2nd. So he is still the chair.
That is an amazing defeat.
Yeah.
Cortez. AOC, is that her nickname?
AOC, it's an easier way to say it, so you don't butcher it.
I didn't realize this. Let me just get this straight. You're telling me that AOC,
Alexandria
Ocasio-Cortez,
right.
We're going to call her AOC. She defeated Joe Crowley, a tool of Wall Street. That's not fair for me to say that in front of you, but he is. Howie Klein loathed Crowley. A socialist defeated Crowley. That's huge.
Yeah.
So if you're so I don't want to put you on the spot there. You're head of the Democratic caucus. Do you disperse money?
There's caucus staff.
Can you give money to candidates?
No. So I think what you're starting to cross a line that most people, it's a very common mistake. The Democratic Party, like the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, that is not government run, right? That gets no federal funds except maybe nominal sort of security funding and other things during conventions. But that is a privately funded organization that exists and organizes itself as a political party. Mr. Perez is the head of the DNC.
Right.
That is the political arm of the Democratic Party. When we talk about the caucus within the Congress, it is simply the way that the elected Democratic members of Congress organize themselves within the Congress. So no, there's no money other than just to pay for some staff. I think there's maybe half a dozen staffers that work for each of the caucuses.
But so what is the power that Crowley had as chairman of that caucus?
There is a significant amount of power in providing the leadership for how the caucus organizes itself and getting to make rulings, frankly, when there are disagreements on how we're going to organize ourselves. So the very first election that will take place on the 28th is to replace Joe Crowley. And the new caucus chair will then run the proceedings for the rest of the elections that will take place, the rest of our leadership elections that will take place on the 28th and probably go into the 29th if they're contentious. So
those would be the leadership elections to nominate a speaker to present to the full Congress.
That's right.
But if the caucus votes for Steny Hoyer for majority leader, that's the final vote, right?
That's right.
That's it.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, Speaker is the only one that we have the floor vote for.
The full House meets in January.
Yes.
To vote for the Speaker. Has it ever been turbulent? Do people get up and speak about the Speaker and who should be the Speaker? And are there debates? Or is it just a series of votes till they find a Speaker?
I'm sure an historian could do a more accurate job than I could in sort of walking you through historically if there have ever been really contentious. I'm sure there certainly have been close ones throughout history. In the nearly 15 years I've been on Capitol Hill, we haven't had one that the outcome wasn't already well known beforehand. Members are not supposed to give speeches. They do sometimes. It's a roll call vote, which means each member needs to verbally sort of announce how they're voting. And sometimes people will say something like, they'll give a little stump speech. They'll stand up and say, I'm voting for Nancy Pelosi because we need to protect people's health care and work on green jobs. And, they'll sort of give their sort of litany of things or a list of the things that Nancy sort of has run on or what the Democrats sort of stand for. And you had it on the other side, too. People will stand up and say, I'm voting for Paul Ryan because we need to protect our borders and cut taxes for Americans everywhere, things like that. But in general, they're not really speeches. They're just sort of going through the roll call vote.
A week from this Wednesday, there will be a vote in the Democratic caucus, and I would assume Steny Hoyer would be running for what title? Majority Leader, which...
That's right.
Then behind him...
There's a whip. Jim Clyburn, I believe, is the only candidate for whip now. Diana DeGette had been running, but I heard today actually that she was going to drop out of that race. So I think it's just Clyburn for the third spot. And those are generally the three. Speaker, Majority Leader, Whip are the three most powerful positions, for the majority when they're in control of the House.
I always thought the Majority Leader becomes Speaker. Did they create a new position in the Democratic caucus?
Yes. So that's a good observation. We have over the course of the last couple of Congresses created some new leadership positions, some sort of more junior positions, the idea being to include more people in the process, give more people an opportunity to serve in that capacity.
Nancy Pelosi, during the lame duck session of Congress, she's the minority leader right now.
That's right. Yep.
So Steny Hoyer can't be the minority leader. What is Steny Hoyer's title?
Steny Hoyer is the whip. He is the minority whip.
And what's Clyburn?
Assistant minority leader. So you've got Pelosi as the minority leader, Steny is the whip, and he's the assistant minority leader. So we sort of created that third position to keep the three-person bench, if you will, sort of fresh so they can move into those three positions when we're in the majority. There's also a handful of other positions that relevant, including the caucus chair, which we mentioned. You've got something called the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, which is a relatively new, within the last two Congresses, a position. There's actually three co-chairs of that. And actually, Ted Lieu is running for one of those positions this term.
I see. And it's called the whip. Why?
He's in charge of whipping the votes, basically a position that is supposed to go around to their colleagues. And there's usually a lot of assistant whips. Ted actually served as an assistant whip in this Congress under Mr. Hoyer. And they're vote counters, right? They need to go out, talk to their colleagues either on the floor or beforehand and find out where they stand on a particular position and report back to the whip's office. And they sort of do the vote counting from there, find out who stands where on different issues. And when you're in the majority, that becomes incredibly important because you don't want to bring things to the floor that is not going to have the support of your caucus.
Yeah. Dick Cheney's horrible, disgusting, repulsive offspring, Liz Cheney, is a Congress. Is it Congress homunculus? I think from Wyoming. Is it?
I'll defer to your characterization.
This is somebody who stood by her father throughout the Iraq War, and then betrayed her sister Mary and came out against same-sex marriage. She's the number 3 with the Republican Party caucus in the House, right? So she would be the whip?
I think that's right. Yeah, I think she'd be the whip, yeah.
Assuming Nancy Pelosi becomes Speaker.
Yeah.
Is Marcia Fudge from Ohio, the Democrat, who may or may not challenge her, is she going to be punished? Do you get punished for questioning whether or not somebody should be elected Speaker?
I mean, I guess it depends what you mean by punished. You certainly wouldn't be on the Speaker's good side. So, to the extent that if you want to get things done for yourself and your district when you're in the majority, it's probably a good idea to have a speaker that's sympathetic when you come to them and say, hey, I really need this provision in this bill because it'll help XYZ constituency of mine, or just I have a personal belief that this is the right way to do this, and therefore I'd really like to push for what have you. In that case, I could imagine a scenario where maybe the speaker wouldn't be as open to hearing from someone who openly challenged them. Although, worth noting, nobody has declared that they are running for speaker other than Nancy Pelosi. Right. So, it's hard to compare. As I've said to several people I've had conversations with over the last couple of weeks about leadership stuff, you can't beat somebody with nobody. The guys who don't want, and they are all guys, who sent this letter, who don't want Nancy Pelosi to be the speaker, need to tell me who they're offering instead. And I don't think it's fair to ask members of the caucus and members of the party to decide between Nancy and nobody. You've got to offer somebody. So let's see who they're offering. But I think, at least certainly from Mr. Liu's perspective, Nancy Pelosi is the most qualified person for the job right now. So
freshman orientation was last week.
Yes.
The new wave of new Congress people come in. They're shown their offices. Is it Nancy Pelosi who's welcoming them?
Nancy, it was certainly among the folks welcoming them. I think most of the current members were very happy to see their new colleagues, their members-elect arrive. Although I should correct one thing. They haven't seen their new offices yet because the old folks haven't moved out yet. Right. So all that sort of happens in December after we break. But I wasn't involved in the their actual orientation where the members are sitting down and sort of getting these briefings and other things. But I did have the opportunity to attend a couple events with a number of the freshman members, mostly social things sort of after hours with Congressman Liu. And I can tell you there's a real palpable energy that comes from this class. I mean, this is a really young, really diverse, really energetic class, the largest one since Watergate. People forget we're going to net about
the largest freshman class of Democrats since Watergate.
That's right. We're going to net about 37 or, I think it's 37 now. It could be as, many as 39, 40 seats before all is said and done. They're still counting votes. But the actual size of the class is going to be close to 60 members because remember, there's a lot of retirees from Democratic districts that, easily reelected Democrats. So the actual new blood is about 60 members of Congress, which is impressive. And if you add to that about 30 Republican freshmen, high 20s, I think it was, you're talking about nearly 90 brand new faces out of 435. It's almost a quarter of the caucus.
Okay. Is this a fair assessment of the process? My understanding of Hillary Clinton and Al Franken when they went to the Senate was, okay, you're superstars. Hillary, you're a former first lady. Al, you're a very respected comedy writer and radio host and best-selling author. Keep your head down. Shut up, listen, and learn. And as I recall, Al and Hillary laid really low the first couple of years in the Senate. My understanding of somebody like Ted Cruz is he's been marginalized by McConnell, Republican leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, and Ted Cruz is the firebrand Republican senator out of Texas. He talks a big game, Ted Cruz, and he can filibuster all he wants, but he's loathed by everybody in the Senate. He's not that important in terms of getting things passed. Is that a fair assessment? And so somebody like AOC in the House, I would assume we're not going to hear a lot from her in the first 2 years. She's going to learn to play ball or end up like Anthony Weiner, who has to, rant and rave in front of C-SPAN to get attention.
A couple thoughts. One is I do think there is a difference between the House and the Senate in terms of decorum and the hierarchy and sort of the structure of the way the place works. I think the Senate is a bit more traditional in that way, a bit stodgier, if you will. I mean, it is kind of the good old boys, kind of club where people do respect sort of waiting your turn, standing in line, learning. And part of that is like the allure of it's designed that way, right? It's the longer terms. It's the upper house, right? It's the House of Lords in our sort of system, if you will. The House certainly has that kind of an element too, and I don't want to discount it and make the House sound like it's just sort of a crazy party all the time. But I think there is a bit more leeway in the House for just the different personalities that exist in what is an incredibly diverse country. So diverse geographically, diverse ethnically, diverse with regard to religion or sexual orientation. And so it's also diverse in terms of personality. There are members of Congress who have served for 18 terms that you could bump into at a grocery store and you wouldn't know their name. There's other people like Alexandria who's not even sworn in yet, and she's a phenom and is somebody that is recognizable, at least in the world of politics, all over the country. So for better or worse, right? I mean, it remains to be seen. Her career and how it plays out remains to be seen as to whether or not that's a detriment to her. And she certainly will have a lot to learn. I'm sure she'd be the first person to admit, it's going to be like drinking from a fire hose for those probably the whole first term. I mean, it's a big job. And, look, it's one of the arguments against, I know this isn't necessarily a popular view, and I'm obviously biased because it impacts my own personal job security, but it is one of the arguments against term limits,
right?
Which is that if you force these members out after however many years, let's say it's a decade, one could certainly make the argument that it takes 5 or 6 years to figure out how Washington works, maybe longer. I mean, I've been here almost 13 years. I learn something new every week, maybe every day. And so if you take the elected members of Congress out of that process by recycling them every 10 years or every 8 years or whatever you want these term limits to be, the real power then goes to who? It goes to staff like me, or it goes to lobbyists mostly. Yeah, it goes to K Street. It goes to unelected bureaucrats in the executive branch. Yeah. And so there's something to be said that if a community wants to continue to send a John Lewis to Congress over and over and over again until he's been there for 30, 40 years, or Nancy Pelosi or whoever, that they should be allowed to do that and entitled to do that.
For more of my conversation with Congressman Ted Lieu's Chief of Staff, Mark Savasco, I invite you to visit me over at davidfeldmanshow.com. And while you're over there, sign up for my newsletter from the KPFK studios in Southern California. Happy Thanksgiving, but most importantly, Medicare for all.